Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and McKim School put me in a daze. Yeah. Okay, guys, have fun. All right, so we left off talking about Emily McKim's grandfather, John McKim Jr., and his possible connection to the ritual raising of Washington, D.C. How many times have they rolled this trope out for the mainstream narrative? 1 million? It happens again and again. And they busted out in Baltimore less than 100 years later, using a fire so good, it's known as the Great Baltimore Fire of 1904. That's how smashing a success it was, right? But before I digress any further, I think it's needless to say that the McKims are proving to be major players in the game of Baltimore. With the Baron's railroad ties and mercantile concerns and Emily's charitable influence. Not to mention that she may be the high priestess of a Diana cult that could be running the show out of the basilica, right? I mean, but it's her efforts as Pimptress, the colonial gospel-preaching founder of Daughters of the American Revolution and the Confederacy, that I thought I was on the right track in thinking that her grandfather, the Baron, and Quaker John McKim, founder of McKim School, were one and the same. What better way to reinforce your phony colonial revolutionary narrative than by pumping it into the minds of young children? Remember back in the Born on the 4th of July episode, I showed that the earliest books written about the Revolutionary War were children's books, and McKim's free school catered mostly to the poor and the immigrants. Perfect victims, for lack of a better word, right? But it turns out that the Baron and Quaker John are not the same man at all, because Quaker John was born in 1742 in Brandywine, Newcastle, Delaware. So clearly not the same guy. And Quaker John dies in 1819, instructing his sons Isaac and William on how to build his dream school, which opens 2 years after his death in 1821. And so regardless of where the indigent and or immigrant populations came from, population growth and how to best control that growth were on these people's minds in the early to mid 1800s. And there aren't many better measures of control than education, because you're putting it into the young. And one of the interesting things about McKim School is that it seems to be evolving with, or maybe even predicting, educational trends. Because while not a school in the traditional sense today, McKim School is open, and it's known as the McKim Center. The McKim Center, building strong community since 1821. So they cleaned the old girl up pretty good for this photograph in 2018. And, looks are not deceiving. It is a temple, right? It's a temple to education. They even call it the temple building. And in 2021, the McKim Center and the McKim Community Association, Incorporated, celebrated the 200th anniversary of its free school, the oldest continuously active out-of-school time educational program in the United States, uninterrupted for over 200 years now. 201. And so as I was saying, it's not a school so much today, but it does offer these programs and services: structure, discipline, love, and respect. Yeah, we see so much of that in the lower income Baltimore communities. Yeah, I mean, it's just crazy. And so what they do is they offer, I think I saw it's athletics programs, after school activities, day camp, summer camps. And so all this happens at the McKim Meeting House, and we're going to talk more about the McKim Meeting House in just a minute. But the 2022 summer day camp is open for ages 8 to 18. And so I'm absolutely certain that this is the best thing that happened to a number, if not most, of these children, which is an unfortunate thing. But, I suppose they're doing good community work here, but who knows? There could be a dual purpose here. That's the whole point of this show, really. Right? And so while it's disappointing, and so it was a little disappointing to be wrong about the Baron not being the founder of McKim School, right? Because he and Quaker John couldn't be the same person, could they? The narrative tells us that they're different people, right? But the McKim Center was kind enough to provide a picture of their Quaker John McKim. And this is it. And when I first saw this picture, I was like, wait a minute, what? He looks exactly like the Baron. Are you McKimming me? Sure, one has a slightly more oval head than the other, but otherwise, these portraits are exactly the same. How is that? How do Genie and the other sites that use this image for the Baron have it wrong? How does the McKim Center get this wrong? I just don't understand, right? Because as of this moment, there's no convincing me that these aren't the same men. yet the narrative has them as two distinct individuals. And so if that's true, if this is really two different people, right, then they must be related. But with the Baron being born in Londonderry and Quaker John in Delaware, I wondered just how closely. And then I found out that Quaker John's father was born in none other than Londonderry. Right? Are you kidding me? Right? This is just unbelievable. And of course, his father was a John too. Right? Is this just more McKimcidence with all these Johns running around and Mud City's predilection for thinking that some of these genealogies are fiction created to mask a longer-lived bloodline? You know, these two portraits being exactly the same do little to dispel that notion, right? And especially when the gatekeepers change things during my active investigation, right? Last updated April 28th, 2022. Right? So, I'm a little slow in making these things. So it was it had been a while since the last time I checked on this. Who knows what monkey business could have happened since the last time I looked at this and when I made this slide. Something is not right about these McKims, and we're going to take a closer look at Quaker John and his sons Isaac and William in the next episode, because I want to close this one out talking about the school, which was Quaker John's dying wish, right? And so I understand the philanthropic gesture of opening a school for the poor and the immigrants, but I don't understand why it needed to look like a Greek temple. And which Greek temple? Right? And so Wikipedia and the school sources, they tell us this. And so they say that it's an archaeologically accurate Greek-style building, right? The front facade here is designed after the Temple of Hephaestus, or Temple of Theseus in Athens, right? And it says that the sides were derived from the north wing of the Propylaea on the Acropolis of Athens. What that was, because I didn't know what a Propylaea was. And so essentially what a Propylaea is it's the entrance to a temple, like this one here, right? And I love this description here. It says this is a 19th century drawing, so the 1800s, of what the Propylaea might have looked like when intact. So they don't even know, really. This is what it might have looked like. And so the thing about the Propylaea is it's the entrance, it's the facade for the majority of these ancient temples. Not just the Acropolis. The Acropolis is just one example. Just like McKim's facade is one example, I guess, right? Although they don't call this a Propylaea here. They say that this is modeled after, the sides are modeled after it, which is interesting, right? But, there are many examples of these Propylaea. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that the Wikipedia article chose to highlight this Propylaea, the Propylaea at Baalbek, one of the oldest ancient sites on record, right, at 9000 BC, which puts it on par with Çatalhöyük, right? And Baalbek grew into an important pilgrimage site in the ancient world for the worship of our boy Baal and his consort Astarte, who's represented here in Baltimore on the site of the B&O Railroad building designed by our boy Douglas Thomas, who may have died at the hands of foul play. All right, so really kind of amazing that I can draw this in from the Propylaea, of the McKim School. Really unbelievable. And McKim School is, of course, on the U.S. National Register of Historic Places. And, I think it's kind of fitting that the side is based on the Propylaea. And in Baltimore, they tag the sides of their buildings, right? As McKim School is presently tagged, or at least it was the day I took this picture. Anyway. But all joking aside, the important part of this building is clearly the facade, which, as stated, was modeled after the Temple of Hephaestus. And I love that they chose to tell us that this was an archaeologically accurate Greek-style building, when no archaeology was needed to recreate this Temple of Hephaestus, because it's been intact since it was allegedly built. The narrative tells us that this structure has been in constant use for 2,500 years. This building was used as a Greek Orthodox church until 1834. Where's the archaeology there? I don't understand, right? And interestingly enough, 1834 is just a year after the McKim School building is either started or completed, depending on the source, but 1833 is there regardless. I got one source that says erected in 1833 and the other completed in 1835. And the coincidence of that 1834 date being sandwiched in the middle of this makes me wonder if perhaps they clandestinely shifted whatever was going on over in Athens at the Greek Orthodox Temple of Hephaestus, right? And just transferred it over here. I don't know. There's something about that, right? And because this is where the story of the McKim School building really starts to take off, right? Because the record is kind enough to tell us who designed this temple for the McKims, right? And this temple was designed by William Howard and William Small. The same William Howard who signs and seals the mutual covenant with his siblings and William Reed, whose family held Howard's Woods, home to Cathedral Hill and Mount Vernon. So why was it so important that McKim's free school be modeled after the Temple of Hephaestus? Were the Williams, Howard, and Small directed to this design? Or were they given free rein to come up with this design on their own? I don't know, but it seems very curious to me that they would go to such length, such expense, to build a school for the immigrants and the poor children when any four-walled structure would do. I can't help but think that maybe that extra money could have been better spent. I doubt the children of then or the children of today cared very much at all that the building is modeled after the Temple of Hephaestus. Why was that important? And so Falcon's maze for the Temple of Hephaestus, of course, begins with the Greek god Hephaestus. And so Hephaestus here, with a statue so accurate, it's on display at the Louvre, right? He was the god of fire, metalworking, stonemasonry, forges, the art of sculpture, as we talk so much about, right? Technology, and blacksmiths, a member of the original 12 Olympians. And so in his role as blacksmith of the gods, right, he makes all the weapons for the gods of Olympus. And it makes you kind of wonder, how powerful some of these gods may have been without him. I don't know. It's a kind of interesting angle on that, I think. And so one interesting element of his origin story is that he's one of only 3 children of Hera and Zeus. And so I never knew that Hera and Zeus had so few children, with there being so many Greek gods out there, so many sons and daughters of Zeus. But the mythology is chock full of stories of how much Zeus enjoyed planting, right? And so maybe it shouldn't be all that surprising at all. Not as surprising as the other part of his origin story, and that's that depending on the myth you're reading, Hephaestus, he was either the son of Zeus and Hera, or he was Hera's parthenogenous child. And so parthenogenous is just a fancy word for asexual reproduction, parthenogenesis. And so parthenogenesis occurs naturally in some plants, some invertebrate animal species, including scorpions, bees, phantasmadeia, whatever they are, and some parasitic wasps, right? They can just reproduce on their own, right? And a few vertebrates, such as some fish, amphibians, reptiles, and very rarely birds. And I love that they close this out by saying that this is a type of reproduction that has been induced artificially in a few species, including fish, amphibians, and mice. And maybe humans. Who knows? It's just, it's really crazy, given the way that genetics plays into the Mud City paradigm. And so while I guess this couldn't be considered a virgin birth for Hephaestus, it is an origin that he shares with none other than Jesus Christo. So there may be some yet-to-be-known connection there, considering the good Christian soldiers that Quakers are, or want to appear anyway. Right? There could be something here. But it's also an origin that he shares with Mud City's main man, the one, the only, the almighty, Yaldabaoth, right? The bastard son of Sophia, the original dragon, king of the worms, right? So clearly no coincidence that they would model their school building after this temple. Especially with Hephaestus being the god of all the things the barons of the age either controlled or coveted. And as much as I would love to do a full expose on Hephaestus here, I just don't have the time. But there are a few things about his forgings that I'd like to bring up because of how they may relate to the Mud City paradigm. And first on that list, aside of course from him building all the weapons of the gods, is that he's the builder of Helios's chariot, otherwise known as the sun. And so now this is really important because if this realm is an artificial construct as the Mud City paradigm accepts it, then so too is the sun. And this is the direction Master of Reality was headed before we were so rudely interrupted by the pandemic. Right? And so Hephaestus' role as builder of the sun machine and McKim School being modeled after his temple could be a back pocket clue to hold on to if I ever return to Master of Reality. Because there's a lot of talk surrounding the sun these days with its flares and sunspots and minimums and maximums. And, I have some observations and thoughts on those things too. And, and so when I was prepping this story, I went looking for a picture of the sun. And of course, yet again, I couldn't find one that I liked. So yesterday morning, I just stepped outside about 9 o'clock in the morning and took this picture of the sun. And so pointing my camera phone directly at the sun, I got this image, right? And right at the top, we have our old friend, the orb, which I liken to the sun simulator, or perhaps somehow involved in the artificial sun machine of the Mud City paradigm. And I know there are channels out there that are actually dedicated to this orb phenomena around the sun. And one of the amazing things about this photograph is that the orb appears to be giving off its own energy or something. It's giving off its own lens flare. Does lens flare give off its own lens flare? I don't know, but this, it certainly looks like it could be some form of binary thing, I don't know. But we're going to come back to this concept of the sun as a construct in a little bit, right? Because in Greek mythology, Hephaestus makes the chariot of the sun. And Helios, of course, has many different names depending on region and era. He's Sol Invictus to the Romans, the unconquered sun. Right? To the Egyptians, he's Ra. The Etruscans knew him as Usul. Right? Tell me of your homeworld, Usul. Which is very close to the Samaritan Utu. And enough for another bad joke. Sit, Utu, sit. But of course, I don't know about you, but one of the first names that comes to mind when thinking about sun gods is, of course, Apollo. And we've seen quite a bit of Apollo recently at the tableau party slaughtering children, the Delphian Club. And it's interesting that in Homeric literature, Apollo isn't associated with the sun at all, but was identified as a plague dealer. So does this mean that the Delphian Club believed that the literature that they were pimping was a plague they were unleashing upon humanity? And if Apollo was a plague dealer, what does that say about all of this Apollo symbolism around Baltimore? And what could be going on over here? I don't know, but hopefully I'll find out someday when Johns and I properly dance. Because it's crazy that Apollo would be a plague dealer. And so one final thought on Hephaestus and his forging of Helios's chariot, which, is the sun. And that's that forge is one of those tricky multiple meaning words, right? Because not only does it mean to build, it has various associations. It's like it could be the actual building where you're doing your forging. And it's also the name of the fire and so forth. But one meaning that forge has, of course, is to counterfeit, right? To make or imitate falsely, especially with intent to defraud. And so this is something to keep in mind in regards to Hephaestus and some of his inventions. That they're counterfeits, they're fake, they're bad imitations of what reality truly is or could be, in the Mud City paradigm, of course. And so next on my Hephaestus list, right, is the fact that Hephaestus didn't work alone, right? He had assistants, and these assistants were Cyclops, which is amazing because we have Cyclops of the Enoch Society in Georgia Tech, possible builders of the Georgia Guidestones. Do the technological geniuses at Georgia Tech consider themselves an extension of this Hephaestian tradition? Do they see themselves as helper to a creator god? I don't know, but all of this is very interesting to take in, as is the fact that Hephaestus also built automatons, or robots. Talk about your perfect metaphors as far as schools are concerned. What does public education do but churn out little automatons, programmed to regurgitate what they're taught and not question authority? If Hephaestus created the weapons and tools of the gods, what better way to honor the weapons and tools you're about to unleash onto an unsuspecting population than to a temple honoring Hephaestus? Free public education. And we've seen how well legislating this has turned out. It's a joke, right? And one that keeps getting better, because we have to remember that as we've seen, Greek and Roman gods like Hephaestus and Diana and who have you are just later regional recastings of much older gods. And Hephaestus is no exception, right? In Egypt, he's known as Ptah, where architecture is added to his pedigree of things he's the god of, right? The Romans knew him as Vulcan. But of course, in Canaan, where Baal is king, he was known as Kothar wa Kahassis. And Kothar wa Kahassis was Baal's boy as well, right? He built Baal's weapons, right? That rained down thunder and lightning, right? And I guess this ancient statue here, he was holding one of these clubs as he's doing here. But not only did Kothar wa Kahassis build his weapons, he also built Baal's palace, which is really an amazing story because metaphorically, Baal's palace is the earth, right? So he would be the builder of the earth, right? And there's a great story in here is how he installs windows in the sky to let in rain. So when Baal wanted to let it rain, he would open the windows, sort of adding this sort of mechanical component to the sky and to nature. And so all of this tracks with the Mud City paradigm idea that Our realm is essentially a terrarium, for lack of a better metaphor or comparison. And so tying Kothar to the possible indoctrination techniques of public education is easy because Kothar happens to be a soothsayer and magician who creates sacred words and incantations, or spells, spellcraft, right? He's a craftsman, engineer, and architect. Of course Kothar is, engineering the minds of the future. And so from this metaphorical, hypothetical, speculational perspective, designing the school to be a temple of Hephaestus makes sense. But how does it make sense from a Quaker's perspective? Because you have to remember that Quakers are a simple, plain people. They don't believe in fancy dress or jewelry. It doesn't make sense that this building, as it stands today, would be commissioned by Quakers, even if they had nothing to do with designing it. Because Quakers, as I was saying, being the very plain, practical people that they are, their churches are very plain structures called meeting houses. And this is the meeting house where the McKim Center meets. Their daycare is here, or their summer camp or whatever. Quakers are not flashy people prone to extravagance. And so if your house of worship doesn't need to look like this, right, then why does your school need to look like this? It just doesn't make sense. Your school needs to look like a magnificent temple, but your church can just be any old hovel? I don't get it. Unless there's some sort of practical reason for it. Places of worship didn't need to be grand because the body was the temple. Unless there's some sort of practical reason for it. It serves a function. There's purpose in this. And if what you're trying to do, if you're using your school to essentially, just for lack of a better word, for brainwashing the future, maybe this type of structure helps in that regard. It must, because why would the Quakers spend the type of money, go to the expense to build it this way if there wasn't some form of practical purpose? The Quakers aren't the ones learning here, right? They're the ones teaching here. And these two buildings are really close together, right? Here it is in 1851, McKim School with its columns, right? And the Friends Meeting House. And here it is on Google Earth. Interesting that it's a Ronald McDonald house, right? And here's the meeting house up here. I don't know if you can make it out. There's a nice big heart on top of it, right? But very, very close together. And it's very interesting to see how this has changed, right? This is now a road on both sides. None of these buildings are here, over here on this side, right? But, this needs to stand. It's a heritage site, right? And you certainly can't do anything that might damage the tunnels that run underneath the McKim School to the meeting house, because I'm sure they're there. And so if the Quakers, with their meeting house and their McKim School, are just cogs in the wheel of social programming orchestrated by the McKims and by the Peabodys and Johns Hopkins, just to scratch the surface, then there has to be a deep significance to this design, considering how it may function as a temple rather than a school. And then there's its other name, right? The Temple of Theseus. How does Theseus fit in with all of this? And so the name Theseus was attributed to the Temple of Hephaestus in the mistaken assumption that it housed the remains of the Athenian hero, presented here in all his glory, because it's hard to find images of him not in his birthday suit. All right, so I'm just embracing it. And so he also has a rich mythological history. Sometimes he's the son of Poseidon, and other times he's the son of Aegeus. And so Aegeus was an archaic figure in the founding myth of Athens. The goat man who gave the name to the Aegean Sea, who was, next to Poseidon, the father of Theseus. The goat man? What? You mean like Pan? Or some other satyr? Was Theseus's father one of these mythological creatures, like the one we have hanging out in Howard's Woods? Mount Vernon here in Baltimore? This representative of Janus or Baal or whomever he may have been roaming around Howard's Woods and the Royal Forest in Baltimore. Because they're certainly not saying Aegeus was Tom Brady. Hey, no. Because doing my Tom Brady-like diligence on the subject of goat men, I found this, and I can't believe I never heard of this before. Right? It's an urban legend, right? The goat man is a creature resembling a goat-human hybrid, often credited with canine deaths, and purported to take refuge in the woods of Prince George's County, Maryland. I was gobsmacked. What? A goat man roaming around Maryland? And so I'm going to have to take a closer look. This is just way too incredible and way too non-coincidental for there to be a goat man roaming around in Maryland. Can't believe I never heard of this before. It just fits in so perfectly with what's been happening out of the Mud City paradigm. Because I'm digressing too much with this already, right? And so Theseus, right, son of Poseidon and Aegeus, also has an amazing mythological history. Because of course he does, right? And you should check it out. It's really an amazing story and one I wish I could get deeper into. But the pertinent information for this story is how he dies, right? And so in 475 BC, Lycotomes, king of the island of Skyros, throws Theseus off a cliff, right? After he had lost popularity in Athens. But Theseus wasn't always unpopular, and this is where the story connects, to the temple and to the McKims and the school, right? Because Theseus's body just so happens to be found by none other than the Greek soldier Cimon, in response to an oracle, and I wonder if it was the oracle at Delphi, right? Cimon of Athens, finds the body of Theseus and brings him back to Athens and buries him in the temple of Hephaestus. And according to legend, right, this is how it becomes known as the Temple of Theseus. This is the same Cimon, or Simon, that I put on the short list of Simons who could have been the namesake of the Clan Frasers of Scotland. And so then, by extension, the McKims. This is really unbelievable. I did not know the story of Cimon and the Temple of Theseus when I prepared the Simon Says video. That's what's so amazing about keeping this thing open and having it be a journey. You never know, man. It just always is going to connect. Because to me, this is just another sign of how on the right track I am. Right? If the McKims trace their origin to this Simon, then designing the school after the Temple of Theseus has even another layer in there. Right? And so how close did the Williams, Howard, and Small come to recreating the Temple of Theseus? Not bad, not that bad. And both these propylaeas look awfully close to this propylaea. And again, just sort of underscoring the idea of education as a new religion, or an extension of the old one, even. And so to close this one out with a small Hephaestian cherry, Hephaestus was also the creator of women, having created the first one, according to the Greek and Roman mythologies, that being Pandora. Right? And so that's going to open up an entirely different kind of box. So, we're going to pick this up in the next episode with more about Quaker John and his sons. And so remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? And so until the next one, cheers.